morning, afternoon, evening, or from wherever you're calling from. First and foremost, before I introduce the guests, I'd like to say I'm extremely honored and grateful to be a part of this. You know, each person here has indirectly or directly really shaped a lot of my thinking, mentorship, guidance, and critical thinking that I needed, right, as a student here in my program. So today is February 23rd, and is the official launch of Dr. Wright's book, which is Heirs of the Great Migration, How the Past Became the Future. On January 25th, Dr. Wright unofficially launched the book along with the video trailer on his YouTube channel. In just 4 weeks, the book trailer on YouTube has amassed over 20,000 views. The book reached Amazon's bestsellers list, #1 in educators' biographies, and #4 in social culture history, and has had some impressive reviews as well. Dr. Wright asked Dr. Khalifah and Irby to read the book before today's launch, and today's conversation really evolves around their impressions of the book. So you'll get to hear a lot of what they had to say from that. And short bios for each of our esteemed guests here. Dr. Decoteau Irby is an associate professor in the Department of Education Policy Studies, where he teaches and advises in the college's urban education leadership program area. He researches equity-focused school leadership as a lever to improve Black children's academic and social emotional experiences and outcomes. An author of the book Stuck Improving Racial Equity in School Leadership, which was just released in 2021 through Harvard Education Press. So make sure you get that along with Dr. John Wright's book as well. And then Dr. Mohammed Khalifah, who is a professor of education administration and the executive director of urban and rural initiatives at The Ohio State University. His research examines how urban school leaders enact culturally responsive leadership and anti-oppressive schooling practices. And he's the author of Culturally Responsive School Leadership, which was also published through Harvard Education Press in 2018, which you definitely want to get that book as well. And last but not least, Dr. James Wright, who's an assistant professor at San Diego State University in the Department of Educational Leadership. As a former international school administrator, his work focuses on how critical self-reflective approaches to principal and leadership training can help disrupt systematic, colorblind, neutral, and indifferent approaches to school leadership. He is the author of Heirs of the Great Migration, How the Past Became the Future. All right, y'all, get ready for an amazing conversation about the book. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it to Dr. James Wright.
Okay, thank you, Eskinder. So FYI, Eskinder Yusuf is a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. He's about to be, soon to be Dr. Yusuf. So we really appreciate you taking your time out to be a part of this conversation. And as Eskinder mentioned, this book was a cathartic labor of love. I'll say a few things before I get Dr. Khalifah and Dr. Irby's take on the book. It was a cathartic labor of love, and it was inspired by some conversations that I had with my mother, which was her birthday yesterday. And the conversations were around our family's migration stories, you know, how, you know, her as a young girl, and her, you know, her ancestors left the Jim Crow South and went north. And so those conversations led to interviews with elders in my family, you know, who were former sharecroppers, and had to endure all sorts of traumatic experiences living and surviving in Jim Crow. And so actually the research for this book started as a doc student. So I was a doctoral student at Michigan State University. And what I had initially wanted to do as an educational leadership student was I wanted to use what came to be known, or what is known as a life history methodology. And I was told, I was sort of dissuaded from it, and told that it was, too untraditional. It wasn't traditional. It wasn't a traditional methodology. And so eventually I was able to find individuals to be a part of my dissertation committee who would support me in doing just that. But in the research, what I learned was, my family's migration, like, the things that were happening, the context, so like my great grandfather, for example, he left North Carolina in 1940, and he moved to Manhattan. He moved to Harlem in 1940, and ironically enough, he moved at a time when there was a lynching epidemic across the South, right? And there was a big lynching case that was in the city of Lewisburg, North Carolina, where my family is from, the same exact year. And it made international news, this lynching case. The NAACP and the NAACP had a significant amount of sway in this time. So it was an international story, and it happened basically in the backyard of my family. And it happened the same year that my great grandfather decided to leave North Carolina. And so as I was learning these different things, I was curious about, what would be the impetus for, someone, my great grandfather in this instance, to decide to leave everything that he's known to go to this unknown land, far away, cold, different, communication styles, different cultural styles, different expectations, to leave essentially everything that he knew for something, completely different. And so that question led to a great deal of insight around, my family's, migration and their journey. So basically, what I'll do is, like I said, before I talk about before I get the impressions from Dr. Khalifah and Dr. Irby, I'll just talk about the big ideas. And number one, the first one is, what is the Great Migration? So the Great Migration is basically a period between 1910 and 1970. So basically 2 generations of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South and going north, in cases of like Chicago and Detroit and the Midwest, and then Northeast, New York City, New Jersey, areas like that, and then West, San Francisco Bay Area, Oakland, Los Angeles, et cetera. And so what happened is, during this period, during this 60-year period, you had a mass exodus of Black Americans leaving the South and sort of reconfiguring major urban cities across the United States, right? So what's interesting about these 2 generations of Black Americans were, they were also 2 of the last 2 of 3 generations of Blacks who underwent segregated schools, right? So they were products of segregated schools. Also, with what also encompasses this group, or these groups, these 2 generations of Black Americans, they were also consisted of the civil rights movement of Black Americans as well. So basically, you have perhaps the most profound, the most progressive, the most revolutionary Black Americans in the history of the United States, if not the most revolutionary, the most progressive Americans in the history of the United States, who were able to, be a part of this movement, 1910 to 1970, right? So, so when we think about this movement, and we think about this migration, and we think about it in the context of today, we think about urban schools, we think about the plight of many of the urban schools, we think about the plight of many of the Black Americans and other folks in these urban schools, and we think about the lack of Black educators in these urban schools, and we juxtapose that with the fact that the best 2 generations of Black Americans who were part of the civil rights movement, who essentially changed the globe. What the civil rights movement did was, it essentially changed the globe, in the sense of you had civil rights legislation that included the Immigration Act of 1964, which lifted the restrictions of migration to the United States that had been forbidden from around 1920. So you had about maybe 4 to 5 decades of the inability to migrate to the United States from around 1920 or so until 1964 with the Immigration Act. And so, in other words, the only folks who could migrate to the United States were Northwestern Europeans. So Africans, Asians, folks from the Caribbean, Latin America. If your folks weren't here already prior to the Immigration Act of 1920, I think it was, if you weren't here then, you could not migrate until the Immigration Act of 1964, which was a civil rights legislation. And after that, we saw mass migration into the United States of folks of color who were not allowed. So, but what the civil rights legislation also gave us was it gave us, as it pertains to this conversation and the group of individuals that are here, it gave us the Elementary Secondary Education Act of 1965. And ESEA 1965 is the source of all equity-oriented policy. So everything that deals with equity and issues of equity today in education is derived from the Elementary Secondary Education Act of 1965. And this was a civil rights move. This was a civil rights legislation. We need to be clear about the fact that ESEA 1965 was specifically designed and was a specific response to 100 years of Jim Crow and several hundred years of enslavement of Black Americans, right? And so ESEA was a civil rights legislation designed around providing equitable access because the federal government had acknowledged that it had been inequitable towards Black Americans for several hundred years. So this was the source of ESEA. Every equity-oriented policy that exists today is derived from ESEA. So this is sort of the context of what drove the book. And within the book, I reflect on, my own personal life, having grown up in a divested community, a community that was ravaged by deindustrialization, ravaged by, the crack cocaine epidemic, ravaged by mass incarceration. And I was, part of a failed public school system, right? And to somehow be in the position that I'm in today, to have conversations around what I lived through, what I experienced, right? So this isn't an intellectual exercise per se. This was my life. I was the product of a failed school system. I was the product of a school system with a wide variety or many Black and brown students with almost no Black and brown educators, right? I was the product of going to school with educators who didn't like me, who didn't like what I stood for, who didn't like the communities that I was a part of, right? And I had to endure that. I didn't have the language then as a student to understand what was happening, but this was essentially what happened to me. And so to be in a position to have the understanding and to speak back to it, and also to reflect on a lot of the choices that I made along the way. I'm very vulnerable in this book. I open myself to a lot of whatever may come with it, but it's my truth and it's my reality, and a big part of the work that I do, working with educators here in San Diego, is critical self-reflection, right? So I implore them to be reflective on who they are as educators and how who they are impacts the students that they teach or the students that they interact with, because the majority of the educators that I encounter here in San Diego are mostly white. They're mostly white educators, and most of the children that they engage with are not white. They're Black and brown. And so it's important for them to be reflective. And so this is my contribution to the reflection that I ask of students who take my class. And lastly, to have Dr. Irby and Dr. Khalifa, these are two individuals that I have a great deal of respect for. They preceded me in the journey as academics. They were both already professors when I was a graduate student. Dr. Khalifa had actually recruited me to come to Michigan State when he was a faculty member at Michigan State. And he's been a beloved friend and mentor from the moment I met him, and he's helped me a great deal along my journey. And then I met Dr. Irby, you know, as a young Jackson Scholar, part of the Jackson Scholar Network. And the moment that I met him and the moment that I heard him talk, I immediately, you know, gravitated to him. And then I started following his work, and I started to, whenever I saw him, I would, you know, pull him aside and try to talk to him. And so, you know, these are two individuals that I have a great deal of respect for. And I'm very interested in what they have to say about the book. I have both of their books, and not because they're people that I'm friends with, but because these two books are fabulous. My students love these books. Dr. Irby's book is Stuck Improving. This is a phenomenal book. My students love this book. Dr. Khalifa's book as well, Culturally Responsive School Leadership. My students love these books, these textbooks. So without any further ado, I would like to get some responses to what was read by Dr. Irby and what was read by Dr. Khalifa, or anything that I said, and we'll just sort of have an organic conversation. So let's start with Dr. Khalifa.
Well, what I could start saying about the book is that this has been one of the most refreshing, palpable, just analytical but personal memoirs and biographies that I've read, actually autobiographies that I've read in recent years, because it's very clear that the book has a deep level of critical self-reflection through the journey. But anybody who is really sincere and open to understanding what's happening in the world around us, they can learn much from this book, because the stories that you tell in the book about what was left by those folks who were refugees of terror from the South and came up north looking for work, and what their children found, which were, you know, closed up and locked up, chained up factories, and the only things that were left for them, that if you just understood that, then that could do so much. That could do so much in dispelling the deficit thought that exists about Black people in this country, that gave a rise to many of the education bills and the criminal justice bills, because all of the modern reform has been anti-Blackness, and that anti-Blackness rests on narratives about Black people that don't tell the story that's in this book. We had no jobs. We had no opportunities. Our schools, they didn't believe in us. So it's easier for people in America, white and Black people, conservative and liberals, to walk away saying that them Negroes in Waterbury are off the chains and they didn't really want to do anything better for themselves. And it's this deep level of historical analysis, even though told through your life story, that is exactly what not just educators need, but what America needs to remind it what it has and continues to do. I love the second part of the title of your book, how the past became the present, became the future. Present, it could be in there too, but future. But there's another fascinating thing about the book, and then I'll shut up and let my good friend, Dr. Irby, weigh in on it too. And I'll say something about both of these brothers. There are few people in our field, I know not everybody here is an educator. There are few people in our field of educational leadership and education administration that when I talk to them, I'm constantly reflecting and constantly thinking and, you know, constantly challenged, which is a good thing. And these two gentlemen that you see on the screen are those are of the top of those people that can do that. So the other thing that you can see from this book are the assets, the magic, the dreams, the aspirations. These young people didn't give up. They turned to hip hop. Some turned to the streets. They had nowhere else to turn. It's either that or starve. I like how you pointed that out in the book. But what it points out is the genius that young street dudes, young hip hop boys, young dope boys, the genius that they had with them, the entrepreneurial skills that they would not, because nobody will ever stop seeking their own humanity and their own dignity. No human being, we're not wired to walk away and to stop seeking our humanity. And what this book showed is that despite the fact that, you know, African peoples, people from the African diaspora are depicted in a particular way in this country with all of the negative discourses, but these people had this genius, this knowledge that they grew out of nothing. And this book really exemplifies that. So cool. Hats off to you for writing it. I enjoyed it. I got emotional at some points through it. Thank you. I'm glad I met you in Egypt and we did stay up all night arguing. I do confirm that part of the book is true. Some of the other stuff, I don't know if you know, dunking and 30 and 40 points in the game and all these other, I don't know about all of that. But that, staying up all night, debating with your behind over in Egypt, that part of it is true. And I'm glad that we did, because now that we got this masterpiece and you as a professor in front of us. So let me stop there, Dr. Irby, and kick it to you.
Cool. Brothers Wright and Khalifa, thank y'all for engaging me and inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Man, this is a joy. You know, I had, as I was reading the book, a feeling that there's the content is content that you can find in other books. Like, your story is unique. The content and the story of deindustrialization and the migration, you can find in other books. So I wanted to start a little bit with style. And I just feel like the style of the book, the style of the writing, yeah, it was style. And I mean, it's something about the Black American tradition that relies heavily on style, vibrancy, liveliness. And those were things that I kept seeing reoccurring throughout the text, is that you talked about gravitating towards the live and the vibrant, and who was the liveliest and who came from the most vibrant hood and that sort of thing, who went to the most vibrant school, the liveliest school. And so what I appreciated a lot was the style and tone. The book was live. The book is live. It moves into, especially how, and I mean, I want to ask questions, you know what I'm saying? So hopefully we can jump into questions. But yeah, I mean, I like the style, the beginning. You know, I'm curious about, you know, you started us, it wasn't in necessarily a chronological order. You started us off at a certain place and then it took us back to tell the story. And so I encourage people to check this out and really look at it in terms of a book that exemplifies a level of style that reflects like hip hop and the liveliest and the vibrant. One of the things that I appreciated most about it is it felt really very much like, so one of the things is I used to write a lot and do a lot of writing about like hip hop as pedagogy. And when I started to gravitate away from like naming hip hop, a lot of people would ask me, well, you know, you don't write about hip hop. Are you still doing hip hop scholarship and everything? I was like, yeah, I am, right? It's in the style of how I write. It's in the style of what I say. It's in the cadence of how the sentences are written and that sort of thing. And so I really felt like this was a hip hop text in my mind, because of the style of the book. It felt like the kind of hip hop memoir that, you know, I've seen, you know, Rakim's memoir, so on and so forth. So, you know, genre wise, I would like compare the book to some of that kind of stylistically. I really, I was drawn in. I thought that the first chapter where you talked about, you know, your mother and your cousin Trey were just, it was a really strong introduction. I'm curious about how you crafted that story. what made you and your process of how you crafted that story, especially you brought us in, you introduced these two key people in your life, and then you brought you and both of those people in your life into the same room with one another and talked about the immense kind of loss that you experienced from, their passing. And then from there, you was off to the races, which spoke a lot to me in terms of this whole idea. There was somewhere early in the book, I think it might have been in the first chapter, where you talked about being rich and how it wasn't a monetary thing, but you always felt rich. You talked about how when you went to Sacred Heart and you was around kids that had more than you never felt like you lacked. You knew that people had something else, but you felt like the wealth and the richness was in the liveliest, the most vibrant, so on and so forth. So I thought that, to me, one of the big themes, this is a great migration story. But to me, it was a story of understanding, as Dr. Khalifa mentioned, the assets that you had in your community, and in the people who you were around. But I would go further. It's something to me that was a little bit more than assets. It was about potential and possibility that you were able to see in the other people who are around you, but I think also that people were able to see in you too. And everybody wasn't able to see that potential in you. But that was a big theme. Like one of the big themes in the book for me was that we really need to be rethinking and reconceptualizing what we mean when we say, you rich, right? Or you got wealth of resources around you and so on and so forth, because you paint a very clear picture that you were born into a Waterbury that was already, dirty water. It was already deindustrialized, and you never even got to see a glimpse of what it was like in its more glorious past. But at the same time, you wrote and you conveyed a story where I could easily see all of the riches and the wealth that were around you during your upbringing. So anyway, I mean, that's where I want to kind of start with style and yeah, in addition to content too. But I think that the style was dope. And as hip hop people, like if we don't get hooked, if the first bar don't hit us, we're not listening to the whole project. You know what I'm saying? I think about some of my favorite lines that get started off with, like Biggie, one of his great lines, like, I know how it feels to wake up, you know what I'm saying? I'm just like, all right, I got to listen to the rest of this song. You know what I mean? And so that's how I felt. I mean, I felt like the beginning and the introduction was so powerful, and it really set the tone for what was to come for the remainder of the text. And like I said, it was a story that was just really powerful. I think I would argue done in a very hip hop, in a way that really reflects your upbringing and affinity for hip hop music and culture.
So what I want to say to that is, I was born the same year hip hop was born. There's no accident. I mean, we're the same age. So, and I remember when the Sugar Hill Gang album single was released, and I remember walking with my older cousin Claudel. I couldn't have been but maybe 5 or 6 years old, right? I remember walking with him to the record store, and he's probably maybe 10 years older than me. And so I remember walking with him to the record store to buy that record. And I remember that vividly. And then I don't know why I remember that so much, but I remember that vividly. And it's not that that's even one of the best records to ever come out in hip hop, because it's not, right? But it was just, I remember that moment, not even having any clue of what was going to come behind it, right? And so I also remember, and I also tell people that, and when people ask me, they say, well, what is the most, profound, or what is your favorite rap song of all time? I don't even hesitate. It's The Message from Grandmaster Flash and Furious. Like, it's that song. That song, we can all, I know, just by you shaking your head, we could all probably write a school curriculum off of that one song alone. 1982, the song The Message. That song has lived on through our consciousness. It has become it's part of the social fabric of the United States. that song is prevalent till right now today. I forget the young hip hop artist that just like, it's a big popular song. She uses it.
Yeah. I just heard. Yeah, it's new. The new song. Yeah. They flipped the sample and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. So every generation, every couple years, someone flips that song. So that song has been part of our consciousness since it dropped. I mean, that song was so profound. And so, you talk about the message, the social context of what was happening in these communities at a time when the government or when the United States had basically left New York City to die and rot. My grandfather lived in Brownsville in Brooklyn. And I remember being a young kid, going to visit him, on Bergen Street, in Brownsville, man, in this place in the late 70s and in the early 80s, this place was, it was different. And so I remember we would have to, drive there, and it was a whole process to get us from parking the car to getting out of the car and getting into the house. It was different. It was a different time. And this is, where hip hop, really saved New York City in a lot of ways. It provided hope for people who were hopeless. And so just being a stone's throw away in Connecticut, it was the same for us. Like, we were the sounding board because we had access to the airwaves. So as these songs and as this stuff was breaking, we got it live. We got it as they were coming. So for us, we were like the first. And then when they did their shows, a lot of times they ended up in our neighborhoods. They ended up in our communities to do their shows. And so I'm glad that you noticed that, because that's a big part of, my upbringing. I mean, it's a big part of like how I was raised. It was a big part of what drove me to a level of consciousness. It's a big part of what gave me a love and an affinity for Black people. It's a big part of what made me defiant of the white supremacy that was trying to be indoctrinated on us in schools. It gave me the ability to be strong and steadfast against what they were trying to suggest about us. Hip hop did that. And so, no, I appreciate that, that the opportunity to say that. Yeah.
Let me ask a follow-up question about that. So you talked about your aunt and uncle in the store. You talk about going back to North Carolina for a bit and noticing some things and coming back. Even after so many of your friends, unfortunately, were murdered, and after you were wrongfully railroaded down in Atlanta, you still never quit. I'm wondering what. And I think hip hop is an expression of this like deep ancestral knowledge and this commitment. What made you not quit? What did you get from your family?
Yeah.
In addition to the hip hop.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not denying hip hop. I'm a hip hop.
No. You what you did was, I appreciate what you did, because I'm not attributing, that no quit to hip hop. I'm not, because what made hip hop was the same thing that made me not quit. It came from our ancestors. It came from a legacy of family, because we're all Southerners, right? I was raised by Southerners in the Northeast. My grandmother was as Southern as they came, and so was my grandfather. They spent 40 or 50 years in the South, before
How would you name it? What are you naming that they gave you? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I don't know. I wouldn't push back on what you called it. You call it ancestral knowledge, so I think it's something that I would say, just in my observations of Black people, it's a love, it's a strength that Black people have that is very hard to qualify or quantify, right? So my grandmother, for example, should have been the heir of land from her grandfather. That land was taken in predatory loan schemes, and eventually it led her back onto the same farmlands that our ancestors slaved on as sharecroppers, right? And so she did that until she was around 40 years old. And when they left, you know, she left North Carolina in 1963 to come to Connecticut. And the same with my grandfather, right? He, you know, they were sharecroppers. They split up. My grandfather went to Brooklyn. My grandmother came to Connecticut. But as a child, the thing that I noticed about them was there was never no hate or no animosity or no bitterness about who they were, right? Like it never dawned on me that these people, what they had to endure. It never dawned on me that what it was they endured. They never said anything bad about white folks, not around me. And they had every right to, right? They had every right to feel a certain way, but they did, for whatever reasons, they didn't. But what they showed, and I'm speaking about my grandparents and, you know, and my aunts and stuff, and my older cousins and my elders from the South who I came to know, you know, because we would always go back and forth. What I knew about them was these were the most loving people. You know, they would give you their last, you know, and they insisted that you ate when you came in their house, no matter how much they had. They made sure that you were as comfortable, no matter how, you know, uncomfortable the circumstances might have been because you were used to a certain thing. But they insisted on this. And so this kind of love, this kind of warmth, this kind of humanity is mind-boggling in the face of what they had to endure. So to me, it's a lesson. It is a lesson from the realm of the unseen that these people were able to have this kind of grace and this kind of, it is a lesson. It is a lesson that these people endured enslavement, that they endured Jim Crow, and then their future lineage, my generation, endured deindustrialization, the thing that took us out of the South and brought us, like, it was this hope and a better future or better possibilities. And as the next generation comes of age, it's taken away, right? And at the same time, our neighborhoods are flooded with crack cocaine all over the country at the same time. Okay, so I'm going off track. But the thing is, my point is, there was a love and a humanity that our ancestors had, that and a resilience that, you know, they lived. It wasn't that they taught us anything. It's just that how they survived. How did my grandmother live 40-something years as a sharecropper, knowing that she should have been a heir to land that was taken from her, and then still have the wherewithal to be the most loving, the most matriarchal to everybody she came across. I don't know a name for that, but I know that that's real, you know. And
that's humanity. That's humanity. Decoteau, I see you brewing over there, brother.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm just thinking, like, a lot of what you're describing, you know, it resonates, you know, in terms of, you know, my own experiences with, you know, especially the elder people having a level of grace, tact, warmth, that it's just, you know, seems unmatched today. You know what I'm saying? And like you said, people want you to eat and feeding you, and you know what I'm saying? You know, just, yeah. So, I mean, it just resonates with me. You know, it brings the question for me because as I was reading, I'm a little younger than you brothers, but as I was reading though, you know, a lot of it felt so familiar. And I grew up in South Carolina. I had family in Philadelphia, so I spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, but I grew up in South Carolina. And to me, one of the things that was remarkable was how familiar the story felt, and the people who you talked about, how you described people, it felt, you know, familiar. I could change a name and imagine it was somebody else. You know what I'm saying? A lot of the situations I could, you know, I think the Sacred Heart stories, that segment really resonated with me in terms of, like, you know, you had to throw down a little fist fight with somebody, then y'all end up best friends or whatever. And like, so all of these kind of things was really interesting because it resonated with experiences that I had and people that I knew and so on and so forth. It also made me begin to wonder and think about, the title of the book, you know what I'm saying? Thinking about this relationship between the past and the future. And one of the questions that came up for me was, um, do some of those things that you're talking about right now, do they still exist? What does the future look like in a place where I feel a lot of those things, that kind of warmth of the people who you talked about? Like, what does that future look like? And then I guess one of the other questions that the book was raising for me was the legibility of the narrative and the story for certain readers, for white people, for the white people in schools who, in our professional lives, we want them to understand us better. I started asking the question like, can they get this? Right? That was because yeah, I mean, it was just like, can they get this? Right? And so I guess one of my questions that I'm curious about, and I invite you to speak to this too, Dr. Khalifa, is that, when I wrote my book, I knew who my audience was. And in large part, I wrote this book for white educators who need to get better at serving Black children. This book is written stylistically and the narrative for a different audience. And so I'm wondering about your intentionality for who you're writing to, who your audience is. And then, Dr. Khalifa, your book is read by everybody. You know what I'm saying? I'm wondering if y'all could talk a little about, as writers, who you writing for, and that sort of thing. I'm just curious, and what we're writing, what that means for crafting a better future, a new future.
I'm gonna kick it to you first, Jane, because James and we actually had a conversation about this, and one of the things I said, I think I indicated along the way, is you ain't writing this for them, and you ain't writing this for everybody. And
yeah,
I was with a young, powerful Indigenous brother down in Dallas a few weeks ago, and he said, this is a part of my methodology. He was talking about his research. He's a new assistant, freshly minted PhD assistant professor. And he said, this ancestral and this indigenous work I'm doing, I will never share that part of my methodology with you white people. And I was happy he said that, because you don't have to give everything to everyone, but the way stylistically you laid this out, James, that's a great question that Decoteau raises. Like, who are you hoping picks this up, or who did you write it for? What was your intention?
I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the response. And like Dr. Khalifa said, we were just kind of having this discussion not long ago. So I have a story. It's quick. So when I told you this book started out as part of my dissertation, where there was a couple of paragraphs that talked about my family's migration story. And so I was so excited, right, when I wrote it, that I shared just that part with one of my cousins, my cousin Derek. My cousin Derek, who's my Aunt Maxine's only boy son, who's the closest to me in age, and we're like brothers. We grew up like brothers, right? Man, we were frickin' frat growing up, And so he said to me, so I shared it with him, and I said, I was excited. And he looked at me and he said, this is some bullshit right here. Excuse my language. He said, this is some bullshit. He said, the reason why is because you left out all of what makes you you. You left out the real. Like, he said, and I said to him, I was a grad student. I'm in Michigan at the time. And I said to him, but I just have to, I want to get tenure. I want to get and I'm talking this language to him. He don't understand that. He don't care about that. He don't care about that.
Right.
He didn't want to understand that. Right. This is my cousin. This is my brother. So I knew right then, I was like, man, he checked me so strong. So to answer the question, everybody that knows me, right? Everybody that I grew up with and that know my story, right? They don't care nothing about 10. They don't care about that. They don't care about this academic part of my life. Like, they're proud of me. and and I've heard people say that they were happy and amazed to see that I overcame so much to get to the point in my life. But what they really are saying is that we remember you a certain way. We remember you like, and I think you need to tell that story because there are so many kids like you, right, that need to hear what's possible. And you need to, I get calls all the time. I have 50 first cousins, 50 first cousins, 50. My mother had 15 siblings. It was 15 of them, 50 first cousins. I lost count of how many second and third cousins. So I have a lot of like little, I still have a lot of K through 12 relatives in my family. And so I get calls all the time from people about issues that happen in their schools. Can you contact the principal about such and such? Can you talk to my son? He's a junior in high school. He a knucklehead. I told him about you. Why don't you talk to him? All the time I get these kinds of calls, right? So who am I fooling if I decide to keep this aspect of my life, right, to myself and within my close circle? So no, it's not for the academics. It's really not. It's not an academic book. I mean, it's been informed by my academic trajectory and the academic tools that I picked up along the way. The academic aspect of who I became very much informs a lot of where the book is going. But to say that is for, that is for white folks, it's not like, because this is what's gonna happen. This is what I anticipate will happen with this book. There will be people who will respect it, and that's fine. And there will be people who won't. They probably didn't respect me anyway. So it's not that I'm losing someone, right? Like, so if there's something about me that if there's something about my story in my past that turns you away from me, then you're really not someone that I want as an ally anyway. You know what I'm saying? And so, so that's my position on it. That's where I stand.
Let me encourage you a little bit more, man. Stand on that courage. As you know, one of the mentors you talked about in the book toward the end is Dr. Chris Dunbar, who was on faculty at Michigan State. We lost him last year, unfortunately, but he wrote his biography too, man. He talked about, he was also ensnarled in a different way from we were. In the whole crack epidemic. He was very open about his past addictions. He wrote the book. He wrote his book and he would not release the book. And then another follow-up story to Professor Irby's question is that I did what you call an autoethnography, which is a little bit more like theoretical than the style you've taken. And I was raised with my two brothers. They were both ensnarled in the street life. They both were multiple repeat offenders, prison. And my oldest brother, he was never really fully humanized in his life before he died. And then my younger brother has been out of prison. But anyway, I sent my younger brother one of the autoethnographies in which he was referencing, and he said almost the same words. He said, "This is some straight bullshit." And he got angry at me, both for me not taking the time, because you can only do so much in a 25-page essay, taking the time to explain what you did in this book in terms of the conditions that were laid out for people, and we were really invited into criminal enterprises. It was an invitation with no other opportunities. What more can it be described as? Is an invitation to partake in some of the enterprises. And my brother was, I think, upset because I didn't do the due diligence that you did in the book describing deindustrialization and mass incarceration and COINTELPRO and all of that other stuff. So I applaud you for standing on your courage and writing your book. And if it's not for the academics, which I always describe pre-tenure as a colonization of minds. And so they colonize you to write for specific people, for them, in specific venues, and this is not that, man. So I'm very proud of this work.
Yeah, I thank you, but I do want to ask you all, because I have been encouraged by, some academics in different fields, but, in some ways, and some folks in education as well. But if you could talk to the possibilities of this book, with regards to educators, like how could you relate this book, or for people who are interested in this book as educators, whether it's educational leaders or teachers, or whatever aspect, how does this book inform or speak to education in a way that educators can find useful?
Yeah, I can take a good jump at that. I know we do have a question in the chat too, so I want to, if we need to open up space for that. For me, I thought that, again, stylistically, this was a very interesting book. Strong because it had style elements that I would feel would resonate with the kids in North Philly that I used to work with. You know what I'm saying? I see this something, I started off teaching GED classes with adjudicated youth in South Philly at a life skills center. These was the kids who was deemed for whatever reason not to be eligible to go back into their schools. So they was court ordered to be at this life skills center. And so I was working with them to teach GED. And I would say that population, a lot of different populations would benefit from a lot of the styles. But at the same time, though, you be taking it there in terms of like deindustrialization, white supremacy, right? So you really write a lot of the concepts that you wrestle with go to, a graduate level, right? Undergraduate, advanced undergraduate, graduate level writing and content in terms of the concepts that you're wrestling with. And so it was, but I think that's the beauty of it, is that you was able to dance in between, it was almost very like Wu-Tang-ish, you know what I'm saying? Where you was hitting people with, the liveliest and the vibrant in terms of the words and the wordplay, and breaking things down in simple terms about what happened and your experiences. But then you was placing it into this context that really drew from a lot of, concepts like, white supremacy, deindustrialization. You had the passages where you talked about politics, so on and so forth. And so I feel like it's a text that would be useful for, and students would be drawn in, but it also provides a lot of opportunities for educators to wrestle with these broader kind of like concepts that will help young people understand the context in which we live within. It blends history. There's a sociological analysis to it. There's, of course, this anthropological ethnography type component that's all in there. So it's kind of all mixed in a very nice way. And like, even within the chapters, you bounce back and forth between the story and then talking about, the concepts of, deindustrialization. And then you making these ethnographic observations about what you see and what you saw and so on and so forth. So it's very rich. And again, it blends multiple different styles and genres and approaches into one text. So that's a long way of saying that I think this was rich. And if I had to give you a push, I would say that you need to have some kind of curriculum or some kind of guidance to accompany this. You know what I mean? That's what I think, you know what I'm saying? Because I'm reading and I'm just like, okay, well, this can work with the young people. But then I'm also like, okay, we could have a graduate level class read this, but some of the other elements of it is going to be foreign and illegible to them. And so, but I think that you would have people in, that college level, graduate level classroom that's more willing to do the scaffolding XYZ. But for the K-12 settings, I feel like it would benefit from some kind of companion curriculum or something like that to give educators, some really good information. Like if you're teaching a segment on the Great Migration, this is a really important text to integrate when you're teaching the Great Migration. Or if you're teaching about deindustrialization, this is a great book to add to the conversation about deindustrialization. If you're teaching a class about hip hop and popular culture, this is a good book to integrate into a course or class or curriculum about hip hop and popular culture, because now you're going to be able to talk about deindustrialization, the Great Migration, the crack epidemic, all of these things that are so influential and present in hip hop culture. So I just think that there's a lot of different entry points And depending on which entry point the students need or where they're coming from, that it would be good to have some kind of companion resources to go along with, so that people could use those companion resources to facilitate the learning that happens. So that's my thoughts about that.
I love that. I think a companion, some sort of learning guide or something like that is very important for this, man, because I think you got to help people take it apart and apply it. I mean, your question, James, Dr. Wright, signals for me something like, what is the purpose of education? Like, give me one scholar in education that's had as much impact on the lives of young Black people than the autobiography of Malcolm X.
I can't, bro.
7 million copies sold, one of the top 10 autobiographies of all time. And I know at least 50 people that told me out of their own mouth that I changed my life after reading that book.
I'm one of them. I don't know if I told you, but I know I'm me.
Yeah. Right. No, you did not tell me. That's 51. So you telling me, instead of trying to bring this to education, I think we need to bring education to this. This is a story about redemption. I mean, bruh, there's no reason why you were not a statistic. Well, you were for a short time, but there's no reason that you were not permanently a statistic, a recidivist, or you're the person murdered like so many of the other brothers that happened in your life. This is a story that educators need to learn how to do. Education needs to come this way, because if we bring this too deeply into education, it's going to lose the impact and the power that it has. And so I think that this is when these young people go in here and they say they don't know how to deal with, these Black kids. This is for teacher educators, and they don't know how to deal with Latino kids, and they don't have. Look, read this book. Right. And so I think a lot of things can come out of that. I think from a Black studies perspective, from anthropological, sociological, historical perspective, and not even deep history. I think that you do justice with some of the terror that happened to your family in the South, and Bumpy coming up and all of that. I think you did justice with it. But I think the real benefit is understanding the current context with this, like what's happened to young people and their families, like parents who have children in schools now. What happened to them? Not so much the grandparents, like what happened to the communities now that we see? And I think that is where the power lies in this book. So I could see folks in education from every aspect of education, history, philosophy, education administration, like that, those teachers that you believed in, that Black brother, unfortunately, who was the teacher in your school, who didn't stand up like he should have. This is something that leaders need to know, that, look, these are the teachers that are encountering. So there's so many jewels and gems that you can pull out of it, man, for different people. So.
Yeah. So listen, this is why, for those in attendance, this is why, these two brothers were invited, because I knew that I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how this book has been received. It means a lot to me to hear you all engage with it and to give me feedback on your interpretations of what I meant. And so I appreciate it. And listen, so we're not going to do a Q&A session right now. We just wanted to have this opportunity. We're going to do a Q&A session later on at a different time. But and I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I do want to say a couple things. That number one, the book is available on Amazon, and it's half price, a limited time right now. We can get it at a half price, reduced price, and then the last thing I want to say is that if there's one last thing from each of you that you want to leave us with, we'll start there. But I just realized that there was something that Dr. Irby mentioned, and I didn't respond to. You asked why or how did the story develop in terms of marrying my cousin Trey and my mother, right? So basically what happened is it's pretty amazing that that all three of us ended up in Waterbury at the same time, right? And it was amazing in the sense that my cousin got married, right? And my mother was like, I mean, the doctors had already predicted that she wouldn't live for another 6 to 9 months, and we were 15 months into it. So, and now she's going to travel from North Carolina to Connecticut because she's not going to miss her nephew's wedding. And so I know I know my cousin Trey is not doing well. I don't know the extent of it, but I knew that he missed something that meant a lot to my mother, a few months back and during Thanksgiving. And so now I get a chance to not only see my mother, but to see him and then be there for my cousin's wedding, right? So I go there. I mean, I can say this in hindsight. At the time, I didn't know all of these cards would play out the way they did. So I go there for the wedding, and then to my surprise, Trey's in the condition that he's in. And so, from that moment of us all coming together, and just, a couple of weeks after I left Connecticut to come back to California, Trey passed away, and then, a few months later, my mom passed away. And so as I started to write the book, which was a few months after the passing of my mother, that was the thing that was in the front of my mind. There was nobody more proud of me, at that point than these two. And there was nobody no male and no female that influenced me more than these two. And the fact that I got to see them in the place where we all came together, right, was really a powerful way to talk about a dying city amongst people who were physically starting to die. And just as life for me was starting to, evolve into like this new life as a professor in San Diego, and all of these things that were happening in my life. And so that was just the entry point of mirroring all of that as an introduction. And so that's how it happened. It wouldn't leave my mind as I started to write.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was I think as I read, I could tell that you started from a place of vulnerability and humility, wrapped up in all kinds of potential and future forward, forward movement and future orientation. It was a great, yeah. I mean, the opening, as I say in the song, the opening line was a hitter. You know what I mean? And so I appreciate you starting from there.
And you ended with it too, man. You ended with mentioning both folk, man.
Yeah,
so I thought that was dope, because that brought it real full circle for me, man. Like, okay, so they were present with us throughout, but you started strong, you ended strong with those same two folk.
Yeah, that was the goal. So if there's one thing that you all want to say before we close out, this is the other thing too. We had a raffle. We're gonna give away a couple of books, and I just want to make sure that someone in the background has pulled some names so that they can give them to me, and make sure that you get some email addresses from those people so that we can contact them and get their information and send them their winnings. So, okay. And now with that, Dr. Khalifa, Dr. Irby, I want to start with you all to wrap this up. If you can, Dr. Khalifa, start with something.
I just want to thank you for writing it, man. I want to thank you for writing it, standing on your principles and your morals and by not veering, and writing a raw, authentic, vulnerable book, man, that many of us can benefit from. I like how you said in the very end that you're trying to pay this forward. You're writing this for the people. You're writing this for your community, for those you love. If a young person can pick this up and change their life, and the way you picked up Malcolm's book and it changed your life, then your goal has been accomplished, brother. So congratulations and hats off to you.
Man, that means a lot, man. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my feedback I guess I have to you is that like I appreciate it. I've read, you know, your work, and this is where I really was able to get a sense of your voice as a writer. In a different way than what I have read otherwise. And I'm just saying, like, man, like, you know, when you lean into your unique voice, you know, the only person that's got this voice. You know, it's like you can see some people, they might start off their career trying to play like Jordan. They try to follow Jordan or Kobe moves. And then they come into their own once they be like, you know what, I'm gonna dribble like this. I'm gonna shoot like this. I felt like this was you shooting the way that you shoot. So I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it. It felt, yeah, I learned a lot about you through reading this particular piece of writing. And so I would just encourage you to keep writing like this. You know what I'm saying? And then to everybody else, if you haven't read the book or if you haven't purchased the book, I encourage you to purchase the book, read the book, give the book to young people with the hope that, you know, they will be able to find a voice and honor their own style. And so, yeah, thank you for writing it. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for coloring outside of the lines of what people tell you're supposed to do in academia, because it's a gift. So I appreciate it. I just want to say thank you for your contribution.
Thank you, man. Hey, I love you, brothers, man. And I couldn't thank you enough, man. And, you know, for your time and for your willingness to read the book and then come on here and talk about it. I know how busy you all are and everything. So, you know, just again, thank you all. And man, hopefully I'll see you all at some point in some place in the near future.
Maybe Egypt. Love you too, brother. You take
All
care.
right.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good one.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you.